The signal came from the edge. It was faint, like a whisper lost in the void. No one knew where it had originated or who had sent it, but its message was unmistakable. It was human. There were patterns hidden in the static fragments of words that sounded eerily familiar enough to draw attention from the fringe of galactic law enforcement and bounty hunters alike. But there was more than just the signal. It was the silence around it, the emptiness beyond the map, the one place no one dared approach. It wasn't a place marked with dangers that could be calculated. It was a place defined by the absence of everything. No stars, no galaxies, no anything, just space itself, stretching into a void so deep and still that it felt like the very fabric of the universe held its breath, as if something else was watching it all. The signal was discovered by a lone scout ship, a small vessel sent to monitor the far reaches of the galaxy's border. It wasn't much of a ship, just an old freighter retooled with outdated tech. But when the scout captain reported the find to the Galactic Council, there was a hesitation that ran through the room like a shiver. No one wanted to acknowledge the gravity of it. But everyone felt it. What was the signal? Was it a trick or a warning? But the council knew better than to ask what lay beyond the map. They had spent centuries drawing up the galaxy and finding ways to keep the edge sealed away from curious eyes. They had been warned by the oldest races in the galaxy that the secret of the void could never be unearthed or understood. No one was supposed to ask why the map ended where it did, yet here they were faced with a mysterious cry for help from the very place they had gone to such lengths to avoid. Captain Lyra Donovan felt the call like a fire in her chest as she stared at the encrypted message blinking across her console. Her crew was a motley band of outlaws and mercenaries, used to finding their fortunes in the most dangerous corners of the galaxy. They had seen their share of strange things, but this was different. This was something unknown, something that could change everything in their world. The bounty hunters had already started circling their ships, glinting in the darkness like sharks. But Lyra knew they weren't the first to hear the call. She wasn't even sure they were the right ones to answer it. But she could not ignore the weight of what the signal represented, the first real clue in centuries that something beyond the galactic maps was still alive, still out there waiting. The crew gathered in the common room, each of them with their own reasons for accepting the mission, none of them knowing the truth of what they were about to face. The mechanic, a wiry young man named Riggs, was already fiddling with the ship's aging engines, muttering something about upgrades. The doctor, Rena, sat cross-legged in the corner, her calm demeanor never wavering as she tapped out a rhythm on the edge of the table. The hacker, Jace, paced in nervous energy, his eyes flashing between the signal and the blinking red lights that threatened to consume them all. And then there was Lyra, standing at the center of the room, staring at the projection of the signal map spread out before them. The void was like a wound in the galaxy, one no one dared to touch, and yet it was pulling them toward it like gravity itself. They couldn't turn back, not now, not when they had the chance to finally uncover the truth about what lay hidden beyond the stars. Lyra stood at the helm of the Indomitable, her fingers hovering over the worn control panel. The crew was uneasy. They could all feel it, the pull of the void outside their hull. It wasn't just the unknown that made them nervous. It was the sheer weight of history pressing down on them. Every empire, every race that had ever existed in the galaxy had avoided this place. But here they were heading straight for it. And all because of one small signal, a voice from the past long forgotten by everyone, except a few scattered humans who still whispered about what had once been their people's destiny. Riggs hunched over the engine diagnostics, trying to keep his hands steady as he adjusted the outdated systems. The Indomitable had seen better days. It was a rust bucket pieced together from old military scraps and salvaged tech, but it had one thing going for it. It was tough. He'd seen it survive things that should have torn it apart. But even he wasn't sure how long it could hold up out there on the fringes of the galaxy, where nothing ever came back. He didn't dare show his nervousness, though that wouldn't help anyone, but it was getting harder to ignore the sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. Jace wasn't much better. He sat hunched over his console, eyes flicking from screen to screen, his fingers typing in a frenzy, trying to decrypt the signal again and again. but each time it came back as gibberish, just fragments of human speech. Mixed with static, the message was broken, but there was something in the way it pulsed that told him it wasn't random, it wasn't just a failed transmission, it was a cry for help, one that echoed through the emptiness, like a ghost reaching out from beyond the galaxy's edge. Rena hadn't said much since they left port, but Lyra could feel her watching her from across the room, the doctor's calm gaze never wavering, always calculating, as if she could somehow sense something the others couldn't. Maybe she could. Lyra wasn't sure anymore what they were walking into, but Rena's silence told her everything the doctor knew. They were past the point of no return. This wasn't just a mission for riches or fame. This was something more, and it was making every one of them question their choices. Lyra leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting on the ship's controls as she stared out into the black void ahead. The Indomitable was far from the safest ship in the galaxy, but it was the best they had, and right now that had to be enough. Their course was set, and the stars were growing dimmer with each passing moment. The closer they got to the edge, the more the galaxy felt like it was fading from existence. A low hum filled the air as the ship's engines powered through the void. Rigs called out from the engine room, a quiet report about the systems holding steady. Jace tapped out another frustrated string of commands, and Rena simply continued to watch the stars outside in silence. But it was Lyra's voice that broke the tension, her words quiet but firm. "We'll find out what's out there," she said. The crew gave her nervous glances, some unsure, some hopeful, but all of them knew the truth. There was no going back now. They had crossed a line, and beyond that line lay not just the unknown, but something far worse, something buried and forgotten by every other species in the galaxy. They were going to find it whether they were ready or not. The ship groaned as they passed the last star system, marking the boundary of known space. A deep chasm of blackness stretched before them. No maps, no coordinates, just emptiness, like a door waiting to be opened. But none of them knew what lay behind it, and that scared them more than anything. The silence pressed in on them, like a weight. The hum of the Indomitable's engines was the only sound keeping them tethered to reality. Outside there was nothing, just blackness. Stars had disappeared one by one, leaving behind an empty void that seemed to stretch on forever. It was as if the universe itself had taken a deep breath and held it, but no one spoke of the growing unease, not yet. Even as the ship pressed deeper into the unknown, every passing minute felt heavier, the weight of isolation sinking deeper into their bones. Riggs kept his eyes glued to the engine readouts, trying to focus on the numbers. The rhythms of the ship's power systems were the only thing that kept his mind from wandering into dark places. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he had his pride and his crew to think about. He'd always been the one to patch things up in the darkest moments, but this time he couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of fixes would help them if things went wrong. Jace had fallen into a trance of sorts, his fingers dancing over his console as the decrypted signal slowly grew clearer. Though the words remained a jumbled mess, he could sense a hidden pattern in the chaos. It was like a code begging to be unlocked, but something wasn't right about it. The more he stared at the transmission, the more he felt the pieces slipping just out of reach, like a dream fading as soon as you woke up. Every time he thought he was getting closer, the message would break into static again, as if it didn't want to be understood, or maybe it was never meant to be understood. Rena remained quiet as always, her eyes locked on the viewport, her posture perfectly still as if meditating. But Lyra noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the armrest of her seat with fingers gone white. It was subtle, but Lyra knew Rena well enough to sense when something was wrong. The doctor had been holding her breath since the moment they entered the void, like she was waiting for something to happen. But so far nothing had, except the endless silence stretching around them. It was Jace who broke the tension first, with a harsh exhale and a slam of his fist against the console. "Damn it, this is impossible," he muttered under his breath. "The signal's just static. I can't get a clean read on it. I think it's broken. We need to turn back. We're wasting our time." But before he could say more, Lyra cut him off, her voice sharp and commanding. "We're not turning back yet, Jace. We're this far in, we're finding out what's going on here, and we're not leaving until we know what's at the other end of this damn signal." But just as she spoke, the air in the room seemed to shift. A low rumble echoed through the ship, like a distant growl that made everyone freeze. Riggs stopped working, his hands stiff on the controls. His eyes flicked nervously to the others. Rena's gaze snapped to the far corner of the ship, her expression unreadable. Jace turned pale as he looked back at the console, and for a moment it seemed like the signal had stopped altogether, as if the universe itself had stilled and held its breath once more. Then it came, the message in full, a clear but distorted voice reaching through the static. "Help us, help us," the voice repeated over and over, the words growing more frantic with each iteration, their frequency increasing like a heartbeat quickening. "Help us, we are here, we are waiting." Lyra's pulse quickened as she leaned forward, her gaze locking onto the signal in disbelief. The voice sounded human, but it wasn't a message from the past. It was happening now. The voice was alive. The crew stared in silence as the words began to distort further and fade, as though the very transmission was being sucked into the blackness beyond the map. And just like that, it cut off, leaving nothing but the empty hum of the ship's engines and the overwhelming silence once more. Everyone knew the message was no coincidence. It was a warning, and now they were too far in to turn back. The silence that followed the disappearance of the signal was deafening, but it was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, a quiet that felt too deep, too unnatural, like something was waiting just out of sight, like the universe itself was holding its breath and watching them. Lyra's mind raced as she glanced around the room, her crew all stiff with unease. Riggs broke the silence. First, his voice low and wary. What the hell was that? That wasn't a transmission, there was something alive. But there was no time to respond. The ship lurched. Suddenly, a deep groan reverberated through its hull, like a dying creature stretching its limbs. The lights flickered as the crew braced themselves. The Indomitable was feeling the pressure of the void around them. It was no longer a mere journey into the unknown. It had become something else, something dangerous. Lyra gripped the edge of her console, her knuckles white, as she fought to keep control of the ship. The artificial gravity wavered for a moment, causing her to sway. But she didn't let go of the controls, not for a second. She turned to Riggs and shouted, "Keep us steady, Riggs. Don't let her fail now. We're too close to turning back. We need to find the source of that message." But Riggs didn't respond, not immediately. His hands were shaking as he worked the console, his eyes glued to the system's display, his brow furrowed in concentration. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke, "Something's wrong with the engines, Lyra. I think something's drawing power from the ship's core. The strain is too much for the systems. It's like we're being pulled toward something." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. Something was drawing power from the Indomitable. It didn't make sense. Nothing out here should be able to interfere with their systems. Nothing except whatever ancient force was lurking beyond the map. It was then that Jace spoke up, his voice almost frantic. "We need to get out of here right now. If this keeps up, the ship's going to tear itself apart." But Lyra ignored him. She knew they were too far in, and she wasn't about to let this moment slip away without answers, not when they were so close. With a sharp command, she ordered the crew to prepare for a full scan of the area outside. They needed to know what they were dealing with, no matter how dangerous it was, no matter what lay out there. She didn't trust the sudden pull of the void. It was too calculated, too deliberate. Something was trying to keep them from seeing what was beyond the edge, something ancient and powerful. The scanner flickered to life with a low hum filling the room, and for the first time since they entered the void, a shape appeared on the readout, something massive and black, as if it were camouflage within the fabric of space itself. It was enormous, and the sheer size of it made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. It didn't show up on any previous map. It didn't belong here. Whatever it was a relic of an age long past, a ship or a structure so ancient that its design was almost unrecognizable. Lyra took a step forward, staring at the projection of the unknown structure on the screen. It looked like a derelict ship, but it was different somehow. Its proportions too grand, its surface too smooth and untouched, as if it had never been weathered by time or space. And there were markings across its hull, strange symbols that no one recognized. Not even Jace could decipher them. His eyes scanned the screen again and again, but it was clear they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. Rena's voice broke the silence as she spoke softly. What if this is it? What if this is the source of the message? What if this ship is the key to everything? But Lyra didn't respond immediately. She was staring at the screen, too focused on the shape in the distance. The ship that was waiting for them at the edge of the map. It was a warning and an invitation all at once. And now they had no choice but to answer it. Lyra's mind raced as she stared at the projection of the strange ship, its silhouette growing larger with every passing moment. It was an enigma, something ancient, something that shouldn't be here. It seemed almost unreal, the kind of thing whispered about in old legends, that no one believed any more. Stories of ships that defied time and space, of species that had been lost to the ages. The crew stared at it in silence, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. But there was no turning back now. Lyra's voice was steady, but her words carried a weight that none of them could escape. We're going in. There's no other choice. We need to understand what's happening. Riggs didn't hesitate. His fingers flew across the console as he adjusted their course toward the massive structure. His eyes narrowed as he fought against the ship's resistance to his commands. The engine strained against the pull of the mysterious force that seemed to drag them closer to the derelict vessel. But Lyra knew the ship was still holding up. They were close enough now. They could reach it in a matter of hours, and when they did, they would find out exactly what lay inside. The air inside the Indomitable was thick with tension as the crew prepared for what was to come. Jace was hunched over his terminal, his face tense, as he tried once more to decode the ancient symbols that had appeared on their scanners. Nothing was making sense to him. The language wasn't anything he had ever seen before, but it wasn't random either. It had a structure to it, a meaning behind the madness, as if it were deliberately trying to communicate with them. But the message kept slipping away from his grasp. Rena stood by the viewport, her arms crossed as she stared out into the void, her expression unreadable. But Lyra could see the subtle signs of concern etched into her features. Rena was a calm one, always the voice of reason, but even she couldn't hide the unease that had settled in her chest. There was something about this place, something wrong with it. It wasn't just the ship or the message, it was the fact that they were here at all. They shouldn't have come, and now that they couldn't leave until they found out why. As the Indomitable approached the massive structure, Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The ship was enormous. It dwarfed the Indomitable, a relic from a forgotten era. It was smooth and sleek, as if it had been carved from a single piece of metal, its surface gleaming with a dark iridescence that seemed to shift as if it were alive. The symbols on its hull glowed faintly in the dim light of the void, like eyes watching them from the dark. It was beautiful in a way that was almost unsettling. But it wasn't just the ship that was strange, it was the way it felt around them, like the air was charged with something, a presence that seemed to reach out and envelop the ship like a blanket, suffocating them in its quiet power. Lyra could feel it in her bones. The ship was ancient, far older than anything they had ever encountered, and it was not alone. There was something inside it, something that had been waiting for them, something that had been waiting for a long time. As they docked with the massive vessel, the crew prepared to disembark. But no one spoke. There was nothing to say. They were about to enter a tomb that had been waiting to swallow them whole. Yet there was also something else, the pull of curiosity, the lure of the unknown. It was stronger than fear, and it had brought them here. They stepped into the airlock, one by one, each of them, carrying their own burdens, their own fears, and their own hopes. But they all knew one thing: they had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The doors of the airlock hissed open, and the crew stepped into the darkness of the derelict ship. The air inside was cold and stale, like it had been sealed for centuries. The lights flickered on as they moved down the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. But it wasn't just the ship that felt alive. It was the walls too, the walls that seemed to pulse with energy, like the heartbeat of the ship itself. And as they moved deeper into its bowels, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, something ancient and powerful, and it was about to make its presence known. The ship was eerily quiet as the crew moved deeper into its darkened halls. The walls pulsed softly with an energy that felt almost organic, like the ship itself was alive and breathing. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of something long forgotten and decaying, but beneath that decay, There was a hum, an undercurrent of power that none of them could explain. The corridors twisted and curved in impossible ways, their angles not quite right, as if the very design of the ship defied the natural laws of space and time. Lyra led the way, her eyes scanning the walls for any sign of movement, every footstep echoing too loudly in the silence. It felt like they were walking into the belly of a beast, something ancient and unfathomable. And as they moved deeper into the heart of the ship, she could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on them. She knew they were being watched, but she didn't know by whom or what. Jace's hands hovered over his console, his eyes darting back and forth as he tried to get a reading on the ship's systems. But every scan came back with more questions than answers. Nothing was making sense. The ship was running on power that shouldn't exist, and the energy readings were off the charts, as if it were drawing power from some unknown source, something outside their understanding. He muttered to himself over and over as he tapped furiously at the console. This doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense. Rena remained silent, as always, her eyes scanning the dark corridors, her expression unreadable. But Lyra could feel the tension in her shoulders. Her movements were measured as she adjusted her medical pack, like she was preparing for something worse than they had ever encountered. And it wasn't just the ship, it was the feeling that had settled over them, all like a dark cloud pressing in from all sides. Something was wrong, something far beyond the reach of their comprehension, and it was growing closer with every passing second. Riggs cursed under his breath as he checked his own equipment for any signs of malfunction. He had always trusted his instincts, but now they were screaming at him to turn back. Everything inside him was telling him they were walking into a trap. But it was too late to back out now. They had already crossed the point of no return, and the worst part was the closer they got to the heart of the ship, the more it felt like it was pulling them in, as if the ship itself had a will, and they were merely pawns in its game. Then they found it, a massive chamber at the center of the ship, its walls lined with strange glowing symbols that flickered and shifted with the ebb and flow of energy. A massive structure stood at the heart of the chamber, its surface dark and polished, as if it were made from the same material as the ship itself. But this was different. It was something more ancient, something more powerful, and as they approached the structure, Lyra could feel the presence within it, like a pulse of energy radiating outward. She could almost hear it calling to her, a whisper on the edge of her consciousness. She took a cautious step forward, and then another, until she stood before the structure, her breath shallow. As she reached out to touch it, the moment her fingers brushed against its surface, a shock of energy coursed through her body like a jolt of lightning, and for a moment everything went dark. Her vision spun, and the world seemed to shift around her, as if reality itself was warping under the weight of the force she had just unleashed. When her vision cleared, she was standing alone in a vast empty space, an endless void stretching out in all directions. She could feel the presence of something ancient and powerful watching her, something older than the galaxy itself, something that had been waiting for eons to awaken. And as it stirred, she realized with a sinking feeling that they had just unlocked a force beyond their control, and now they would have to face the consequences of disturbing it. Lyra staggered back as the energy surged through her chest. Heaving with the aftershocks of the blast, her heart pounded in her ears. The world around her rippled like water disturbed by a stone. The chamber shifted and warped, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing at the edges. But then everything stilled, and she found herself standing alone in the vastness of the void. The presence she had felt before was no longer just a whisper. It was a force, a weight pressing down on her, as though the entire universe was watching and waiting. She turned around, but there was nothing, no walls, no stars, just a black expanse, stretching endlessly in all directions. The air felt thin and cold, as if there was nothing left to breathe in this space. It was emptiness itself, and yet she could feel something in the air, something ancient, and ancient beyond measure, a presence that was both unsettling and awe-inspiring. Lyra tried to move, but her body felt heavy, like it was being pulled in every direction. At once her legs felt like lead as she took a hesitant step forward, but when she moved it felt like she wasn't moving at all, like the space around her was refusing to acknowledge her existence. The sensation was disorienting, as if time itself had lost all meaning, and with every step she took the void seemed to close in on her. the weight of something unseen pressing in from every angle. She reached out her hand into the darkness, expecting nothing but emptiness, but instead her fingers brushed against something solid, cold, and metallic. It was as though she had touched the skin of a massive creature, a beast that lay dormant beneath the void surface, and as she continued to touch it, a hum began to fill the air around her, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lyra jerked her hand back, the noise almost deafening in its intensity. She turned her head, desperately searching for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. There was no ground, no horizon, no way to orient herself in this strange place, just the cold and endless blackness that stretched on forever. And then it came, a voice, not one she could hear, but one she could feel in the depths of her mind, a voice that wasn't human, but felt as though it understood humanity better than they understood themselves. "You have awoken me." It said its words like a vibration through her skull. They had a resonance that was both terrifying and hypnotic. "I have waited for this moment for eternity, and now you are here." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped here, caught in the grip of something that transcended space and time, something older than the galaxy itself. The voice continued to reverberate through her thoughts, and the words felt like chains wrapping around her mind. "Do you know what you have done, human? Do you know what it means to disturb the sleeping one, to awaken what was never meant to be awoken?" The voice paused, and for a moment Lyra's body trembled under the weight of its gaze, the force of its presence washing over her like a tide that threatened to drown her. "I will show you the truth," the voice whispered, and in that instant she felt herself being pulled deeper into the void. Her vision blurred, and the space around her twisted, as if the very concept of reality was bending beneath the will of the ancient being. Lyra's scream caught in her throat as the darkness consumed her, and in that instant she understood the true cost of their curiosity, the cost of waking something that should have stayed asleep forever. But it was too late now. The being was awake, and it was only a matter of time before it revealed its power to them all. And as the darkness closed in, she knew they were no longer alone in the universe. Lyra's mind reeled as the darkness enveloped her. Every instinct screamed for her to break free, to escape. But there was nowhere to go, no way to fight the force that surrounded her. It felt like her very essence was being pulled apart piece by piece, her thoughts fragmented into whispers and echoes lost in the void. She wanted to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the infinite blackness that surrounded her, until she was no more than a fleeting thought in the vast emptiness. Then came the sensation of falling, not physically but mentally. She felt her consciousness being ripped from her body and cast into a new plane, one that stretched far beyond the limits of what she had ever known. It was as if her mind was being torn across the fabric of space itself, pulled through an endless torrent of time and memory, and for a moment she thought she might lose herself entirely. But then she felt a presence beside her, not comforting, not familiar, but powerful, a weight that filled the void and steadied her. A voice echoed through her mind, cold and ancient. "We are the forgotten ones, the lost gods of the stars, the ones who have slumbered for eons, waiting for the moment of your arrival." The words reverberated through her skull with such force that she could feel the very structure of her being shake under their weight. It was as if the universe itself was speaking to her, showing her truths that were far beyond human comprehension, truths that had been hidden for millennia, the very essence of what humanity was and what it had become. The being's voice was 1,000 whispers, all layered over one another, a cacophony of voices speaking through her mind. "You have found us, you have awoken us. And now you must pay the price for your curiosity, for your meddling in things that should have remained buried. It's too late to turn back now. The chains of fate are already cast." Lyra felt the grip of its power tighten around her mind, as if it was testing her resolve. She could feel her thoughts beginning to unravel like the threads of a broken tapestry. But she fought against it. She clung to the fragments of her consciousness, refusing to succumb to the void's crushing weight. She wouldn't let it break her. She wouldn't let it take everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to protect. And in that moment of defiance, something strange happened. The pull of the being's presence faltered just for a second, as if it had underestimated her, as if it hadn't expected resistance. Her mind flickered, and for an instant she saw the faces of her crew through the darkness, their expressions wide with fear, but still determined that they were out there somewhere fighting to keep their ship intact, fighting to survive. And for the first time since they had boarded this cursed ship, she felt the stirrings of hope in her chest. The being seemed to notice the shift. Its voice grew colder, more forceful. "You cannot escape this fate. Human, the price has already been set." But Lyra refused to listen. She gritted her teeth and held on to her resolve. No matter how small that hope might have been, she clung to it like a lifeline in the sea of shadows. She wasn't going to give up, not while there was still a chance. And then she heard it, the faintest whisper of movement through the darkness, the crackle of energy that felt almost familiar. And before she could react, a flash of light burst through the void, and for a brief instant, the darkness shattered. It wasn't a physical light, but a presence, a connection, a bridge between her and her crew. Somewhere far beyond the empty blackness, she felt them, their fear, their determination, their strength. And in that moment, she knew they weren't going to let her face this alone. The being's voice raged in her mind, a storm of fury and hatred. But it was too late. The light had already taken root. It was growing stronger, and Lyra's connection to her crew was expanding with it. The void around her seemed to warp and bend as their combined strength began to push back against the ancient presence. But the being was not defeated, not yet. Its grip still held fast, but Lyra could feel the resistance growing. "You may struggle for now," the being whispered, "but in the end, you will understand what you have awoken, what you have unleashed. And when that truth is revealed, you will wish you had never stepped foot on this forsaken ship." Lyra didn't answer. Her heart was pounding. Her mind was a whirlwind of thought. But she refused to back down. She had crossed this line now, and there was no going back, not until she had seen this through, until she understood the cost of the knowledge they had so recklessly sought. The darkness trembled around her as the voice of the ancient being grew louder, its power pressing in from all sides like a tidal wave of cold that sought to drown her. Every breath was a struggle. Her heart pounded as she fought to hold onto her mind. The presence felt like an abyss waiting to consume her, but Lyra could still feel them, her crew, their strength, their will pulling her back from the brink. Even in this place of endless void, they had not abandoned her. The light they had created together pulsed brighter with every passing moment, growing stronger, more resolute, until it shattered the darkness around her, and for the first time she felt herself gaining ground against the being's power. The weight of its influence lessened, like the crushing weight of gravity had been lifted from her chest, and in that brief moment of clarity, she understood something crucial. The being was not invincible. It was not the end of everything. It had a weakness, just like anything else. But that weakness was a truth that had been hidden away for eons, the truth of what had happened long before the stars had been born, the truth that only a few in the universe even dared to consider, the truth of their existence, the truth of why the map ended where it did, and why the rest of the galaxy had chosen to forget. The being's voice rumbled like thunder, a deep vibration in her mind. "Do you understand yet, human? Do you understand what you have awoken, what you have unleashed, and how it will change the course of your history forever?" Lyra's mind whirled as the light around her flared brighter. She could feel the pulse of her crew behind her pushing forward. As one, they were not just fighting for survival. Now they were fighting for the truth, for the knowledge that had been locked away for so long. She could feel it in her bones. The ancient ship was a prison, a tomb for the beings that had once ruled the stars, and now they were free once more, and they had no intention of leaving quietly. She gritted her teeth and focused on the task ahead. She could feel the pulse of the ship beneath her feet, the hum of its power, the presence within it, its influence over them. But there was something else too, something she hadn't noticed before, something that had been hidden behind the veil of darkness. The ship wasn't just a relic of the past, it was alive. It was part of the being itself. Its design was not meant to be a home. It was a weapon, a tool for something much darker than they had realized. The voice in her mind continued to reverberate with a cold and calculating tone. "This is your final chance, human. Accept the consequences of your actions. Bow before us, and allow us to restore the balance we once had, or face the wrath of the universe itself." But Lyra's resolve hardened. No, she wouldn't bow, she wouldn't submit, not to this thing, not to anything that would seek to enslave her world, her people. She had come too far, seen too much to back down. Now the truth of the universe was hers to discover, and she would not allow it to be hidden away in the shadows any longer. In that moment, she felt the final shift in the energy around her, the presence of her crew joining with her, the full force of their unity pressing back against the being's influence, until the void seemed to ripple and crack like glass under pressure, and with one final surge of power, the darkness shattered. It was no longer an empty void, no longer a prison of silence and fear. The light had driven it back. It had shown the truth that the universe was not governed by the will of these ancient beings, but by the will of those who dared to dream and defy the darkness. Lyra's eyes snapped open, and the world around her returned to the ship. The cold air of the derelict vessel was gone, and in its place was the familiar hum of the Indomitable's engines. Her crew was standing around her, their faces filled with concern, but they were safe, they were alive, and they had broken the hold of the ancient ship. And yet she knew the fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The galaxy would not forget what had happened here. It would remember the day the map ended, and the day humanity crossed the boundary into the unknown. And she knew one thing for certain: the secrets they had uncovered would echo through the stars for centuries to come, because some truths were never meant to be uncovered, but now that they had been, they would change everything.